Good evening, everyone. Tonight we mark Yom HaShoah. We mark the loss of 6 million Jews in the Shoah, each a world. This year, thinking about senseless violence is not far from our hearts as we watch the atrocities that are happening in the Ukraine. For many of us, the images, stories, and horrors are a reminder of what unchecked power and human evil can perpetrate in this world. In tonight's program, I hope that you will be inspired. I know you will be inspired by the stories of the righteous that are among us, those that risked everything in order to save the innocent and terrorized, those who had the vision to imagine a different world and the courage to act to save so many Jews. Tonight, we bring you a remarkable story of the village of Le Chambon and the surrounding villages who together saved thousands of Jews during the Shoah, as well as members of the French resistance and those fleeing forced labor in Germany. This year, we are going to welcome Nelly Trocmé Hewett, Pierre, Sauvage, and Peter Feigl to tell the story of the isolated French community that banded together to offer Jews sanctuary and shelter during World War II. The story of Le Chambon, which you will learn tonight, begins with Pastor André Trocmé and his wife Magda. Always a pacifist, Trocmé practiced a quiet but firm resistance to the Vichy government. Le Chambon was a town of around 5,000 people. It doubled in size as it took in every single refugee who arrived and provided refuge for an estimated 5,000 people. The people of Le Chambon acted on their conviction that it was their duty to help their neighbors in need. When the deportations began in France, Pastor Trocmé urged his congregation to give shelter to any Jew who should ask for it. He said, and I quote, "The responsibility of Christians is to resist the violence that will be brought to bear on their consciences through the weapons of the Spirit." The villages were quickly filled with hundreds of Jews. Today, we celebrate the heroism of the people of Le Chambon, and we honor Pastor André and Magda Trocmé. We're going to begin by hearing from Peter Sauvage, who is an Emmy award-winning documentary filmmaker. He is also a child survivor of the Holocaust and was born in Le Chambon. He has created an incredible movie about Le Chambon, and it is in 1982, he founded Le Chambon Foundation, which is committed to exploring lessons of hope along with the Holocaust lessons of despair. We will see some of his featured documentary, Weapons of the Spirit, which was created in 1989, and we are so thrilled to have him here with us tonight. After Pierre, we will hear from Peter Feigl, who himself is a survivor, and he will tell some of his own story. And then you'll hear back from me as we move to honor all of the people of Le Chambon as we hear from Nelly. Thank you for being here.
Yes, I am the guy who was on that train, although slightly older. I'm a 78-year-old European-born Jew, and that means that around the time of my birth, much of my family was humiliated, tortured, and murdered while the world watched. I'm very pleased to participate in Hadass Israel's Garden of the Righteous tribute to Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, to the area of Le Chambon. It is especially touching to me to be participating alongside my old friends, Nelly Trocmé Hewett and Peter Feigl, who provide important testimony in my film, Weapons of the Spirit. Yes, I had a singularly lucky birth, since I was born and protected, along with my parents, in that remarkable haven of refuge in the mountains of South Central France. There, The peasants and villagers turned no one away, betrayed no one, attempted to convert no one. There, the people of the area defied the Nazi occupiers and the French Vichy regime that was collaborating with the Nazis, turning their tiny community into one of occupied Europe's most determined haven of refuge for the Jews. There was something to be done, and they just did it. No big deal. It was who they were. In Le Chambon, the very day after France fell to the Nazis, the pacifist pastors of Le Chambon had proclaimed the need to resist violence, quote, through the weapons of the spirit. The pastors knew their congregation would understand that admonition. At the time of World War II, most of the peasants and villagers of the area of Le Chambon were descendants of the Huguenots, the first Protestants in Catholic France, who had themselves known persecution and slaughter at the hands of the kings of France and their own countrymen. Much is different in Le Chambon today, but a friend who helps today's refugees there told me a few weeks ago that as of then, 86 Ukrainian refugees had found their way to Le Chambon. Like peasants elsewhere, the older inhabitants of this windswept, wintry mountain enclave tended to be wary, taciturn, and private. I knew that, like rescuers everywhere, they would not readily expound on their deeds or their motivations. It was thus with more than a little apprehension that I walked up the hill almost exactly 40 years ago to shoot the very first interview for the documentary. I was presuming to attempt. It was to be with Henri and Emma Héritier, a peasant couple in their 80s, whom I planned to film standing outside the farmhouse they had turned into a place of sanctuary. It seemed natural to begin filming with the Héritiers. They remembered my parents well. Their daughter Eva had helped take care of me. I knew the Héritiers would do their best to humor me. As it happens, the Héritiers were among those who had taken the greatest risks, for they knew full well that among the Jews they had taken in was a teenager who had become the village forger, spending his nights making false identity papers for all who needed them. Towards the end of the war, German soldiers were stationed smack in the middle of the village. Monsieur Héritier was a beekeeper. His response to the increased threat was to hide the forger's paraphernalia in his beehives. Weapons of the Spirit was not an easy film to make. It took me a long time to begin to understand the people I was hoping to celebrate, to grasp that the shrug of a shoulder could be more meaningful than 1,000 words, and that people who act well under challenging circumstances are not fundamentally different from each and every one of us. I wanted the film to be dramatically effective and tell a story, but I also wanted it to be historically impeccable. Most challengingly, I knew nothing about Christianity and very little about religion. I came from an ardently atheistic background. I still don't consider myself religious. Yet I was determined to respect and convey the particular slant on life these activist Christians had exemplified in their deeds, and to better understand the nature of these weapons of the Spirit. The challenge for me was to suggest the heroism of my protagonists in the eyes of those they sheltered, without betraying the simplicity and seeming casualness that was inherent in that very heroism. Whatever the temptations, I knew I mustn't make these people seem, quote, larger than life. The point, after all, was precisely the opposite. If indeed, if somebody hadn't already used the title, I might well have called the film Ordinary People. One complicating factor for me was that was very personal, and had significant psychological ramifications. That factor was that my parents' firm wish to keep their own life histories private. Just how much of a right did I have to detail publicly the relevant circumstances of my own birth? No answer seemed obvious, but I needed to honor my parents' feelings to the extent that I could. And they had been among the survivors of that time who wanted to put the past behind them, where they felt it belonged. For them, my father, a French Jew, born in Germany of Polish Jewish parents, and my mother, a Polish Jew, this had gone so far as to hide the fact that they were Jewish and to hide it from me and my brother and sister. I didn't learn that I was Jewish till I was 18. My parents courageously attended an early screening of a rough cut of the documentary. My mother then asked me to remove 3 things. In particular, and most egregiously to my mind, she didn't want her murdered relatives to be named. I thought my mother had no right to ask me this, which was so contrary to Jewish beliefs. But I felt that under the circumstances, I should honor her wishes while she was still with us. Among the many changes to the entirely remastered version of the film that will be coming out soon will be my acknowledging of the members of my mother's immediate family who were murdered. And I want to do so today on Yom HaShoah. My grandmother, Feigl Suchowolska, my uncle, Memo Suchowolski, my aunt, Helena Pizar, my aunt's husband, David Pizar, my very young cousin, Frida Pizar. Incidentally, Frida's older brother was Samuel Pizar, who survived the death camps and achieved prominence before becoming the stepfather to my cousin, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State. Sam was a major influence on Anthony, as he was on me. In closing, I thought I would recall that before locking the picture, as we say, I returned to Le Chambon once again in 1986 with a copy of the work print of the film. I had organized a gathering of Jews who had been sheltered in the area during the war, and I'd agreed to screen the film for them and for our Chambonnais friends. Too many of the latter had already died. Despite the usually apt conventional wisdom about never screening a work print, I welcomed the excuse to share the film with its aging protagonists and was also eager to receive any timely feedback that might come my way. Many of the people in the film, Jews and Christians, attended the screening. This sort of event is a privilege reserved for documentary filmmakers. No big ticket mainstream director gets to screen his film with the actual characters present and reacting. I'd returned too late to see Madame Héritier again. Her death during the editing had found its way into the very fabric of the film itself. But the door to the Héritier home was open, as usual, when I came by shortly after my arrival in Le Chambon. Monsieur Héritier was sitting at his kitchen table, staring into space. His health was not too good, he said, reminding me that he was 87, and expressing some concern about the possible emotional impact for him of seeing the film. I imagined that he was wondering what it would be like to see Emma again, his late companion of 64 years of life together. But his daughter Eva did bring him to the screening. Afterwards, I went up to him in the lobby of the tiny new movie theater in Le Chambon. He was standing against the wall, surrounded by several generations of his family. He was smiling. And I felt like a king as I was introduced to the family members I didn't know, some of whom remembered the baby that used to wake up the neighborhood. He was back at the kitchen table again when I came to say goodbye. What was he going to say about the film, if anything? Quote, "The film was better than I'd expected," he volunteered rather seriously, and I took this as high praise. When I had to leave, he told me to wait a minute, then walked over to the cupboard. The beehives were a thing of the past, as he could no longer climb the hill to them. But he still had a few jars of his honey left, stamped with his name. He got one and handed it to me. "Here, take this," he said. "That way you'll think of me once in a while." There's no reward in the world that will ever rival that jar of honey. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, Alice Israel Congregation, for asking me to participate in this evening's event. I was a 14-year-old child, born in Berlin, Germany, and my parents, like Pierre's parents, were atheists, wanted nothing to do with religion. And I had no idea about persecution. In my first grade in Germany, I learned in school that Jews were despicable people that one had to hate and to beware of. And when my parents left Germany, excuse me, to go to Austria, my father's hometown, my parents decided that it might be a good idea to have me baptized Catholic, since the Nazis were ranting and raving against Jews in Germany, and Austria had a long tradition of hating Jews. So my first exposure to religion really was in the Catholic Church. I had my first communion there, and in due time, we managed to escape after the Germans annexed Austria. We went to Belgium. From Belgium, when the war started in May 1940, when Germany attacked Belgium, we fled to France. My mother and I and my grandmother were locked up by the French in a camp first. We managed to get out of there. We ultimately settled in the south of France. In August of 1942, my father and mother were arrested on the 26th of August, and were shortly thereafter sent to Drancy, a collection point, and from there they were sent to Auschwitz, where they were killed. I also lost, during the Holocaust, my father's youngest sister, who was murdered in the killing fields of Belarus. I was fortunate of having been in a summer camp operated by the Quakers when my parents were arrested. And the day I learned of their arrest, the day after, on the 27th of August, I began to write a diary. Ultimately, after passing through Marseille, possibly going to the United States, I arrived in Le Chambon. And if I may, I'd like to just read to you, this is my introduction to Le Chambon. The diary was dedicated to my dear parents and started on the 27th of August. And I made the following entry on Saturday, January 16, 1943, quote, "I took leave, took the first streetcar at 6 a.m. and at 7:20 a.m. left aboard the Marseille-Paris Express," end quote. After changing trains, taking a bus back onto another train, I continue, quote, "Arrived in Saint-Agrève at 11:59 p.m. There, a Mr. Daniel Trocmé had come on his bicycle to meet me. Still a young man and very nice. Now, we still had to cover 15 kilometers through this ice and snow on a moonlit night. When we arrived at Le Grillon at 2:30 in the morning, I was dead tired. There, we ate something, and then I went to sleep in the annex. I only saw Mr. Trocmé. And then on Sunday, January 17, I wrote, "I got up at the stroke at 9 this morning and little by little made acquaintances in the kitchen. It was really very nice and clean. Later, I went to see Amédée, the boy with whom I was to stay. I played and thought a lot about you. there are children there here in various situations, some like me. I now discovered that I was in a home that was managed by Nelly Trocmé, a young man about 26 or 27 years of age. And as I said, I was 14 at the time. I was not introspect. I was mostly interested when is the next meal, and really accepted whatever was given to me in Le Chambon, and did not fully appreciate what these good people did until many years later. But to give you an idea that, first of all, here are people who clothed us, who fed us well. Nelly Trocmé also saw to it that other children, such as I, whose education had been interrupted repeatedly as we fled from one place to the other, that we would get some schooling. And while in school, occasionally we were told to quickly leave and go pick mushrooms. I never really questioned why, but I wondered, in June, mushrooms, that's something you pick in September or October. Only many years later did I discover that someone had alerted the villagers that there might be a police raid, and they got all the children out into the woods to protect us. Daniel also was responsible for a second home, one that was occupied by much older children. They were all 17, 18, 19. And so he was rushing back and forth between them. And in spring, for instance, he provided us with a pair of sandals, which were made of rubber tires from into which he had managed to attach ropes. And when he gave me one of those sandals, as a spoiled brat that I was, an only child, I rejected them, and I said I wouldn't be caught dead wearing something like that. Many years later, I realized that poor Nelly Trocmé, probably to ruin his hands trying to cut tires and making sandals for us. But that's something that I didn't appreciate until much later. I was also one of those who benefited from false papers. In September of 1943, I was provided with a false identity card. My name was changed to Pierre, a nice sounding French name. And I, together with 4 other boys, also provided with false identities. We were sent off to a high school as boarding students, and in order to enable us to continue our education. The reason that we were sent away from Le Chambon was because of the fact that Daniel had been arrested and had himself been executed by the Nazis, something, again, that we didn't find out until many years later. Now, it is years later, and especially at the time when Pierre Sauvage asked me to participate in his documentary, that I began to realize the tremendous risk that the villagers took. And to best illustrate this, and he calls it a conspiracy of goodness, if you've ever been in Le Chambon, there are some streets that are very narrow. The streets is just wide enough to accommodate a horse-drawn carriage. So the people living on one side of the street would see the light going out in the house across the street for their neighbors on the ground floor, and they knew that in a matter of about 19 seconds, the light would come on the second floor. And they now knew that it would take them about 7 minutes and 33 seconds for the light to go out, the time for them to brush their teeth, put on the nightgown, and go to bed finally. And yet no one evidently asked their neighbors, tell me, how come there's a light on the second floor in the other room? Are you having visitors from family visiting you? No. As Pierre says, it was a conspiracy of goodness, and the people, no one asked and no one told. There is something else that I became aware of years later. During those years, there was a great shortage of food everywhere, and many farmers enriched themselves by providing, exchanging food that they produced a sack of potatoes, a ham hock, and so on, to urbanites that came over the weekend when we're willing to trade Oriental carpets, items of value, jewelry, and so on, just to get something to eat. Well, the villagers of Le Chambon, they did not want to enrich themselves. They gave the little that they had because their land was not very fertile, and they supported some 3,500 refugees, mostly Jews. And I am particularly moved whenever I see Pierre's movie. There's one scene where an elderly lady clutching a Bible in the crook of her arm and shuffling towards her temple. Pierre asked her to tell me, Madame, why did you do these things? This was dangerous. And in the most natural way, the lady says, tapping her Bible, it says so in the book. It says that if someone is sick, you go to their bedside and you bring them cheer. If someone is hungry, you ask them to table and share what food you have. If someone needs shelter, you open your door and you provide shelter. I think, to me, it chokes me up whenever I tell this story, but it best illustrates what the righteous and good people of Le Chambon did for me and for some 3,500 other people, and I'm forever grateful to them. And shortly in June, I will be going back to Le Chambon for another visit. I'm now 93 years old. It'll probably be my last visit there. So with that, I want to thank everyone. And again, thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Pierre, for sharing your stories, for sharing your film, for sharing Le Chambon with us. It is an honor. And the lessons are timeless. Even in today, we can think about our own Hebrew Bible and think about the most important lessons of feeding the hungry and visiting the sick and helping those who need care and refuge. We are now going to turn over to our cantor, Ariane Brown, who will be singing the Partisan Song, a song about bravery.
Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst den letzten Weg. Hat Himmeln bleien, verstehen bleie Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Schau. Es wird erpäugt an unser Trott mir seinen da. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Schau. Es wird erpäugt an unser Trott mir seinen da. Von grünem Palmenland bis weißem Land von Schnee. Wir kommen an mit unser Pein, mit unser Weh. Und wo gefallen, sie zersprit von unser Blut. Sprotzen wird dort unser Gewurre, unser Mut. Es wird die Morgensonne begierden uns dem Heind. Und der Nächten wird verschwinden mit dem Feind. Nur ruhig versammeln wird die Sonne in dem Kajor. Wie ein Parol so gehen das Lied von Dor zu Dor. Das Lied geschrieben ist mit Blut und nicht mit Blei. Es ist nicht kein Liedl von einem Feigl auf der Frei. Das rote Volk zu Fischen fallen dicke Wind. Das Lied gesungen mit ner Garnes in die Hand. Das sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst am letzten Weg. Gott Himmeln bleien, verstellen bleie Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Schau. Es wird erpäugt an unser Trott, mir sehnen da. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Schau. Es wird erpäugt an unser Trott, mir sehnen da.
It is now my honor to introduce you all to Nelly Trocmé Hewett. I'm going to give an introduction to Nelly, and then I'm going to present our Garden of the Righteous award, as well as we will show a picture of a plaque that has been added to our stone of the Garden of the Righteous in our actual garden. First, want to introduce you, give a little biographical detail to Nelly. Nelly was born in northern France in 1927 to Pastor André and Magda Trocmé. In the early 1930s, her family moved to Le Chambon, a rural community in southern France, at the invitation of the Protestant Church. Nelly described her parents as strong and dedicated people who had amazing stories even before the war. When the pastor and his wife Magda organized the rescue of several thousand Jewish refugees during World War II, the entire community rallied to their leadership. And right before we got on this live presentation, Nelly wanted to make sure that I was going to mention all of the people who gave refuge to Jews, to the Jewish refugees, and not just one family, but it was several villages of families who opened their homes and their hearts and their tables. Nelly, we are unbelievably grateful for the Jews that you saved because of the courage of your family, because of the conviction of all of the people of Le Chambon. It is an honor to present you with this award. Let me show it to you. This award, I will read you the plaque, which says, Garden of the Righteous Honoree Le Chambon and surrounding villages that saved Jews during the Holocaust. From Addis Israel Congregation, Washington, D.C., April 27th, 2022. And I also want to ask Courtney to show us the picture that is now in our Garden of the Righteous at the synagogue itself. And you can see the village of Le Chambon, which is now forever in our Garden of the Righteous. Nelly, it is an honor to have you here tonight, and we are honored to hear your story.
Am I supposed to talk? Oh, here we are. My story is very different from the Pierre Sauvage and Peter Feigl. They were both refugees. They were both Jewish. I was just the daughter of a minister who was farmed out, literally farmed out in the mountains of central France because he was a conscientious objector. The French government and the French Protestant churches and other churches did not recognize that position. They felt that conscientious objectors were traitors. They were not honest. And so from northern France and an atmosphere of working people in mines and factories, and before that, from a year in New York City where my parents met because they were both coming there with a scholarship, my father from France and my mother from Florence, Italy. And they ran into each other and found out that they had the same ideas, the same ideals of service to humanity, of doing something that would be helping other people who needed it. They just fell madly in love and got engaged in 6 weeks. So you can see it was a huge success, and they remained married all the way, which is quite extraordinary too nowadays. So I remember my arrival in Chambon. I was 7. It was so drab, so gray. This little town with no colors at all. At the time, even in the summer, no flower buckets, around the village, and people who were very silent. The population was mostly Huguenots. That is, who are the Huguenots? They were the very first Christians from France who were persecuted and killed by the kings and the church together. They were it was a Holocaust. They were trying to eliminate them. I mean, there was a massacre on the Saint Bartholomew in Paris where they actually threw, I don't know how many thousand Protestants out of the windows of Paris down to the basement, to the street, and killed them that way. So the Huguenots fled. They tried to protect themselves, just like the Jews under Hitler fled to try to find a place that was safe. The Huguenots fled and looked for safe places. England, Holland, Germany, even Sweden. The Bernadotte family is of French descent. And the ones who were not, and then the pilgrims who came to your East Coast, those good Calvinists, very austere, serious Calvinists, the ones who didn't know how to do it and where to go or were too poor, just holed up in the most isolated locations. And the plateau, Vivarais-Lignon, where I arrived at age 7, is one of those locations. Just very narrow streets, roads, I mean, winding roads, climbing up the mountains. A little narrow gauge train, which you saw on Pierre's film, an occasional bus. People didn't have cars. The town was smaller than mentioned. The town was only 2,800 people, and mostly farmers who came from their scattered farms in the countryside. The countryside was beautiful, rolling hills on this 3,000 high plateau, rolling hills and streams and thick wood forests where we did pick mushroom. Not in June though. Yeah, I did pick mushroom in the forest, like Peter Feigl said. It was quite an idyllic place for us, the children, and for refugees who started coming. The first one that we thought was possibly Jewish was Hilde Höfer, who became my German teacher in school. She was from Vienna, and she advised some friends of hers to join her from Vienna. And from there, you know, the tom-tom of the jungle circulates the news very, very fast, and more people learn. Excuse me. Learn that there was a safe place, maybe, and they arrived. I was a typical teenager. We knew what was happening, but we knew in general terms. I was, 13, 14, 15, 16, too young to be really informed, too young to join the underground. And my parents were very wise in not telling us any details. But we knew lots of stuff was happening from the conversation at the table, from following the news, and from the people who kept arriving at our house. We didn't have a regular family life. Our house was sort of a grand central station of refugees and farmers and people in need. They would come. If it was a meal at mealtime, mother would feed them. The food was atrocious. We were really hungry. The milk and the eggs and bread were rationed. We had coupons. We had coupons for clothes, so we were very poorly dressed. Our outer garments were mostly capes, Loden capes. And nothing worse than a wet Loden cape when you come home and there is a cold home because there's not enough coal to heat the home. The Loden cape remains damp, becomes smelly. We all smell like wet dogs, but we didn't care because we all smell like wet dogs. And for shoes, when our leather shoes were worn and we didn't have coupons for new shoes, we wore clogs. So we trundled around in our Loden capes that were wet and our clogs. And we were perfectly happy because we didn't know any other lifestyle. It was so simple and it was so unexpected, but it was so interesting. And we knew that our parents were doing something that was very important. And that was the whole idea. Now, the number of Jews that were protected in the area, there has been all sorts of estimations, but wild estimations. I brought here a book that just came out. Oops, here. It's called Mais combien étaient-ils? Meaning, how many were they? It is written by a local PhD, a woman who married a Jew and lived for a long time in Israel. And she went about documenting very scientifically every single known Jewish refugee who came to the plateau, when they arrived, what their name was, what their false name was, if they had a false name, where they lived, how long they stayed, when they left, and lots of documents, lots of personal letters from these people. It is an amazing book. She came to a total of nearly 2,000, not quite yet, but she's still working on it. Apparently, there are still people who have to be discovered. But so saying 5,000 or 3,500 doesn't apply. Although there were other kinds of refugees. There were refugees from the French government who went underground because they didn't want to go and work in Germany. And there were refugees who, young people who came to join the military underground, the armed resistance. So you had these two kinds of resistances in the village, and they didn't work together well at all. You had on one hand, the nonviolent resistance using the weapons of the spirit, and then the armed resistance, which actually slowly but certainly built and trained young men to fight against the Germans at the time of the liberation. I don't know if any of you read the book about Virginia Hall, a woman of no importance. Well, she was an American who was not Jewish. She was a social lady. She came to France and decided to stay, and she became a spy for the British. Meanwhile, the Germans knew her well and looked for her all over the place. She limped. She had a wooden leg because she had had a hunting accident. She shot herself in the leg and her leg had been cut. So the Germans were looking everywhere for that spy who limped, never found her. But she did arrive in Chambon, and she actually, I didn't know her. The nonviolent resistance didn't know her, but actually she was with the violent resistance, and she was heading all the parachuting from England up on a high plateau above the village, parachuting of materials, of small armaments, of clothing, of some food. So you see, there were all sorts of resistances and all sorts of happenings that nobody really knew well about. I should say that my house was always full of strangers. My mother was awfully busy. She always had au pair girls, so we were never abandoned, but she was not around too much. My father was not around at all, and if he was around, he would lock himself up in his office to prepare stuff and to prepare sermons. So he was a distant individual, except once in a while. At the end of a dinner, if there was some time, he would pull out his accordion and we'd start singing. And we sang and we played with harmonicas and blockflöte, German wooden flutes and ocarinas, but those happenings were very joyful, but not very frequent. But we did have 1 month a year when we had the legal vacation, and we all took off away from Le Chambon, trading parsonages with somebody else. And we had a real vacation. But the house was, as I said, Grand Central Station. I would arrive from school and there were strangers around. The dining room, which was also a living room, had the people sitting, waiting in line, like in the doctor's office to visit with my dad. I mean, it was a strange life, hard on my little brothers. I didn't mind so much. I was 13, 14, 15. I had my life, you know, and I was a Girl Scout and I was athletic and so forth and so on. But it certainly was not a regular life, nowhere. The thing that was the most interesting was the fact that there was very little talking, because rescue can take place only when no one talks. There was a silent network of people working to hide refugees, and A would know B, B would know C. They all worked the same way, but A would know who C was, although they knew each other. For instance, the house where Pierre Sauvage was born, the Héritier farm, the two girls were in my class at school, Eva and Berthe. And I didn't know their parents were hiding Rozovsky, who was making false cards. Furthermore, my father didn't know Rozovsky, didn't know who he was, because Rozovsky was in the more on the violent resistance side. No one talked, and certainly the farmers didn't talk. There's nothing more silent than 19th century farmers who have not evolved very much and who still lived in very poor conditions on little farms and just managed to survive, and they were not talkative. So the secrets were all around. That's it. So as a teenager, I was not really mixed with the hardcore difficulties of life. Yes, the food was terrible. We ate a lot of lentils because Le Puy down the mountain was a headquarter of lentils, and a lot of chestnuts, because south of us in Ardèche, it was chestnut land. So that was local food, but otherwise we were very limited. And my parents would, for instance, my mother would trade cigarette coupons for food. But we had also alcohol coupons. But my parents would not trade their alcohol coupons. They just destroyed them because there was a lot of alcoholism among the farmers who were very isolated for long winters in their farms out in the country. So it was a tough period, which I survived, I would say, with inspiration, because I didn't know enough. And when people ask me nowadays, how was your life there? And I said, it was war times. We didn't have anything, and yet it was the happiest time of my life because of the idealism and the healthy environment, which was mine during my growing years. That's about it. I could add a lot of details, but you have a general idea now about. And I am older than Peter Feigl and Pierre Sauvage, you know, so I was already a teenager when they were young. Feigl was 14 and Pierre Sauvage was a bit born. So I'm way up there. So I'm very pleased that I could talk to you. It is a privilege to have been invited. And thank you for the menorah, which will be sent to Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, and the local little museum will decide whether it should go to the city hall or whether it should go in the museum as a gift from your congregation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. As we move into the memorial section of our Yom HaShoah observance, I share with you the Song of Babi Yar. I invite you to open the translation posted in the chat. 33,771 Jews were machine gunned on September 29th to 30th, 1941 at Babi Yar, a ravine on the outskirts of Kyiv. This ravine became a mass grave for over 100,000 victims, the majority of them Jews. I dedicate this song to their memory and to those suffering in the same region today. Wollte ich auf gehangen durchs Wegel auf a Backen und geheudet, mein Jüngele, mein Jankel, ist die Stube Trunen mit der Flammfeier. Wie kann ich heuden, mein Jüngele, mein Teier? Zugebunden durchs Wegel auf a Bäume und geheudet, mein Jüngele, mein Schleime, ist mir geblieben, kein Wodem von kein Schich, ist mir nicht geblieben, kein Bändel von kein Schich. Ich hab geschoren, die Zepp meine, die lange, und auf sie das Wegel aufgehangen, weiß ich nicht versuchen, die Bändelach anzünden, die Bändelach, die Teiere von beide meine Kinder. Weiß ich nicht versuchen, helft mir, Mames, helft mir, ausklagen mein Nigen. Helft mir, Mames, helft mir, dem Babi Yar verwegen.
We now turn to recite El Male Rachamim for all of the 6 million who were killed in the Shoah.
El Male Rachamim Shochen Bamiromim Hamtzei Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei HaShechinah Imhalot Kedoshim U'Taharim Kezohar Harakia Mazhirim Lenishmot Kol Acheinu B'nei Yisrael Shenitbechu Vashoah Anashim, Nashim, V'taf, Shenachneku, V'shenisrefu, V'shenehergu, Shemosru et nafsham al kiddush Hashem. V'gan Eden tehei menuchatam. Ana ba'al harachamim. Astirem b'seiter kinafecha le'olamim utzror b'tzror hachayim et nishmotehem Adonai hu nachlatam v'yanuchu v'shalom al mishkevotehem v'nomar Amen.
Exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and the pure, to the souls of all of our brothers and sisters who perished in the Shoah, men, women, and children of the house of Israel, who were slaughtered, suffocated, and burned to ashes. May their memory endure and inspire deeds of charity and goodness in our lives. May their souls be bound up in the bond of life, and may they rest in peace. And let us all say, Amen.
Amen.
And we now recite the Mourner's Kaddish together. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, v'yalma divrach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei d'chol be'Yisrael, v'agala v'zman kariv v'yimru Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam omei omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yipa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudesha brichu. Le'elah min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata da'amiran b'alma v'yimru Amen. Yehei shlama Rabbah min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru Amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol yoshvei tevel v'yimru Amen. We are going to conclude with the song Am Yisrael Chai as we go from deep, deep mourning, to remembering that the Jewish people have survived and we are here and we live on. And through our lives, may we carry forward all of the memory of those who we lost in the Shoah. I want to thank tonight Pierre and Peter and Nelly for being with us tonight, for sharing with us your own individual stories, for helping us learn about the heroes of Le Chambon and what is possible even from a single individual when we open our doors and we say that we are welcoming, we are ready to receive those who need help. And in today's world, we know 100,000 refugees to America from Ukraine that need help, that need housing, that need food, that need resources. This is probably one of the greatest gifts that we can learn from Le Chambon, is that all of us have the potential to make a difference, no matter who we are. So thank you for being with us and for sharing your stories with us. I want to thank Courtney Tish, who ran all of the back end of our program tonight. I want to thank Burl Saltman, who every year points out she has become a master of knowing stories from all over the world of the righteous that are still alive and living and telling their stories. And we are so grateful, Burl, for all you do for our Garden of the Righteous program. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in, for being with us. We have recorded this program and will certainly make it available for those who are not able to join tonight so that it can be shared far and wide. And we conclude tonight with the song, Am Yisrael Chai. May the people of Israel grow in life.
Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. 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 Od Avinu Chai, Od Avinu Chai, Od Avinu, Od Avinu, Od Avinu Chai, Od Avinu Chai, Od Avinu Chai, Od Avinu, Od Avinu, Od Avinu Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael 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 Chai. Od Avinu Chai, Od Avinu Chai, Od Avinu, Od Avinu, Od Avinu Chai, Od Avinu Chai, Od Avinu Chai, Od Avinu, Od Avinu, Od Avinu Chai. Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael.